Yeah? There's a few more seats in the first row. They seem reserved. They are reserved by who's not here by now. Okay. Well, I think let's start. It's usually German manners to put a towel on a sunbed in the morning, and I welcome you very much here to this panel on demographics and politics. My name is Florian Eder. I'm a managing editor with Politico in Brussels, and some of you might know me as the author and editor of my morning column, Brussels Playbook. And we're doing one little advertisement here, especially for the OECD Forum every morning with my colleague Ryan Heath and Pierre Briançon. So if you haven't registered yet, please do on politico.eu for a OECD Forum very special daily playbook this week. I'd like to introduce to you my distinguished panelists here. I start with Bruce Stokes, who's a director for global economic attitudes at Pew Research. Then we have Artig Heus, was that right? The chairman and CEO of Bertelsmann Stiftung, next to whom sits Anna Wittgren, the Secretary General of the European Youth Forum, and last but not least, Eva Zeglowitz, a political scientist and statistician, as I've read, from Austria. Without further ado, as we're already a little late, I'd like to start the discussion. The forum's motto this year is what brings us closer together, ce qui nous rapproche. To see clearer what that might be, it's maybe helpful to look a little bit at some things that divide us in the first place. We've seen some very disruptive and actually divisive election or referenda results in the past years, from Brexit, Trump, to actually also the French election, and the most recent Italian elections were very divisive for the respective countries. I'd like us to first take a look at all those, or some of those votes, and look at the demographics of those results. Actually, I'd like to start with you, Anna. The Brexit vote has often been described as something that the older generation inflicted on the youth, not thinking about the next generation, just thinking about their own anger and rage, and in particular because the youth obviously couldn't be bothered to just turn out and go to cast their ballots. Is that a structural problem? Is it that the youth can't be bothered to exercise their political powers and their voting rights?
Thank you very much. Well, if you look at demographics, and especially with the turnout with Brexit, there is, of course, a trend that one cannot ignore, that in traditional forms of politics, for instance, turnout, yes, the participation of young people has lowered. Of course, if you look at the proportion of young people who did turn up, they mainly voted to remain. So a lot of people did feel very much that the future had been robbed by the older generation. But from the perspective of the European Youth Forum, and if you look at participation in non-traditional forms, so not just in terms of turnout, but also in terms of activism, volunteerism, taking action in societal things, young people are actually not apathetic and have a very big role to play and actually do take the stage. But a lot of young people feel disengaged with traditional politics, with their politicians. They don't trust the institutions. And this is a massive issue. But there's also a lot of structural barriers in place for young people to participate. Socio-economic factors have come to play. If you look at populations, for instance, people who do not have a stable life pattern in terms of income, in terms of where they live, in terms of jobs, are less likely to vote no matter what stage in life, but the percentage of people that are in such a state when it comes to young people is much, much higher. So is it therefore so strange that compared to other population, there's the other segments of population, there's less turnout for young people? Should we not look at how do we facilitate that? How do we ensure that, or ensure that young people feel represented? In Europe, 0.5% of parliamentarians are under 30. That means that very few people, actually speak out for young people, and young people identify them. All these are structural barriers that, again, perpetuate this problem and perpetuate inequalities.
Is there, I'd like to come to Eva. You're from Austria, and in Austria there has been a change. They lowered the voting age to 16 years. Has that changed anything in the recent election in Austria?
Well, Austria lowered the voting age more than 10 years ago, and a lot of research was done about how young people reacted, and there was a lot of concern about, will they care about politics? Will they know enough? Will they turn out? And I think a lot of questions were asked to young people that are not asked to older people. So are they informed enough to vote? That's a question that was asked for 16 and 17-year-olds, but not for 56 and 70-year-olds. So I think it was a bit unfair, but in the end, it had a lot of attention to young voters, so media reported about everything. And together with the lowering the voting age, we had a bundle of measures that included strengthening civic education and so on. So in the end, what we find in Austria is that young people, 16 and 17-year-olds, they do turn out much more than 18, 19, 20-year-olds. So they are more sheltered, they are more informed, they go to the votes together with their families, they discuss in schools and so on. So on the voter side, a lot of hopes had been fulfilled, and a lot of fears had not been proven true. But on the other hand, we do not see a radical change of political parties, that they transfer their issues towards young people, or that they change their agenda towards young people. So this is the part of the deal that I think is still missing in Austria.
Actually, on Anna's point, Austria has the youngest chancellor, the youngest prime minister, if we speak in European terms, of all countries. Has that?
That's true, but I think that's a coincidence. That is not a cause or effect thing that has to do with lowering the voting age.
No, I didn't think it was that way around. But does that appeal to young voters, or does it more appeal to their mothers and their future mother-in-laws?
Well, what the surveys show us is that the party, the People's Party, which is led by the young Chancellor Sebastian Kurz, has most votes within the oldest voters. So the generation gap is quite huge. In local elections very recently, I think it was a factor 2 or 3 between the vote share among the under 30-year-olds and the 60 plus for the People's Party. So it's not necessarily like this, that young people vote for young front runners. No, it can be the other way around as well.
And that's how it was in Austria. The grandmothers voted for.
Yes, in this case, yes. Within the very young voters, we find higher shares for parties that are currently in the opposition, which for a very long time were the Greens and the Freedom Party, the right-wing populist Freedom Party. But now the government has changed, so in the next election we will see if this pattern holds true.
Bruce, with your experience from America, we just spoke before, and you said young people just don't vote in America. Why is that? Why is that a special case? Do they feel unconnected? Do they feel not represented? What's the case there? We've heard from 2 different perspectives already. Now, what's yours?
Well, you're right. They don't vote, and if you look back at elections over the last 3 decades, whether it's a congressional election or a presidential election, even though voter turnout goes up in a presidential election, they are still the age group that's least likely to vote consistently throughout all of those elections. And so our data, I think, suggests that your point, that they feel less connected to the locality in which they have to vote, because they are less likely to own a home, they're less likely to have children in the schools, they're less connected to these issues, is one issue. Certainly when we ask people what are the major challenges facing the country, and we do that every year, they just have different priorities than older people. While we certainly don't have an exhaustive list, it's more than 24 issues that we ask people about. Young people's priorities tend to be broader, global, what I'd say with a small g, and the big picture issues like climate change, whereas older people's issues tend to be more about taxes, about crime, about things of that nature, which you might define as more local and more immediate and maybe more reasonable to link to actually voting. But we do know that young people tell us they are less likely to follow what's happening in government, in politics, than older people, by almost 2 to 1. Older people are more likely, people 65 or older, are more likely to follow what's happening in politics and local government, or in government in general. We ask people, do you talk about government and politics every day with your peers? And while only 24% of people who are over 65 say they talk, only 11% of people 18 to 29 talk with their friends. So they're not engaged in it. Now the question is why. We don't know that, but we know that they don't. They tell us they don't, so I think that's probably one factor. They tend to have lower civic knowledge when you kind of ask them a variety of civic knowledge questions. Kind of knowledge questions in general are always dangerous to ask the public because you always have your heart broken when you realize how little people understand things. But relative to other age groups, they have less civic knowledge. So that's, again, maybe a reason. They're less likely to say that voting matters. We find that they are also less likely to be engaged in some of the formal activities that are related to politics, like give money, contact an elected official, meet with an elected official. They're just less likely to do that than older people. It is true that many are engaged in political discussions on social media, and it's probably not surprising that older people are probably less engaged in that. But then again, more young people are on social media than older people. So it may be that they just see that as a different forum for engagement. But in terms of the formal way in which you impact upon policy and politics, which is through engagement with the existing political process, consistently across the board, we find that young people are less engaged.
Our question would be, why is that? And the Bertelsmann Stiftung has done a survey and a report, I remember, talking exactly about that. Young people are less engaged. Why is that? What can be done to give them a better voting experience, if you speak in terms like that? What can be done to bring them in?
Yeah, thank you. First, in reaction to you, Bruce, I think we are all familiar with the fact that older people tell us how the world should be ruled. When I was young, it was told to me. When you were young, it was told to you. And older people have the tendency to think they know better, and younger people are maybe more indifferent. So partly it's also a fact of experience in life that you engage more. But at the same time, I see as a serious problem that the younger generation is giving the harshest assessment on the failure of current democracy. They are interested in politics. If you talk with them, they are interested in issues. They are interested in climate change. They are interested in social issues, etc. But they don't think that voting really makes a difference. They do not understand what is a political party. The older people in Austria that love the older parties like a younger one to be the Hoffnungsträger, huh? So the one who personifies the hope. But I think, and also from our work, the analysis is that the younger you are, the less likely you vote. The less education you have, the less likely you vote. The less job you have, the less likely to vote. So the difference in the participation of a younger, not highly educated, jobless person compared to a well-off 50 or 60 plus with a higher education is almost a double. So this is the disruption that we see in the democracy, and it has partly to do. So what should be done?
Are the German figures, or
what
we're just citing German figures or European?
I think this is this failure of traditional democracy is a phenomenon that we see in the Western world, where we had a democracy very much based on the idea or the illusion nowadays that political parties would represent all kind of ideologies, parts of the population, and in fact this internal democracy in political parties is not working as it was assumed. Maybe it never was a realistic expectation, but that said, there is, I think, a failure of democracy in the current stage. So the agenda is, I think, a double agenda. It's on the one hand, how to involve younger people more in the current power play, which is controlled by democracy. So how to engage them, and there something like voting with 16 is an excellent idea, because once, that's also our research, once you start voting, you keep voting. It is path depending. Voting is path depending, and if you discuss it in school and with your peers, then you do more. So this is how to involve the youth more. And the second thing that we have to do is that we have to renovate democracy. We have to find out how in the 21st century can we engage, can we, so to say, benefit from the, how can we unleash the potential of engagement of citizens for politics beyond the traditional party political ways.
And I'd just like to reinforce what you said. I mean, our surveys show that basically young people are less likely than older people to believe that voting gives them agency, that gives them a sense of control. Only 53% of young Americans say that voting gives people like me a say over what's happening. 73% of older people say that.
And they're maybe not right, but they still like the illusion.
Yeah, that's that perception, right. And you're right. I mean, there's a difference here between reality and perception. But
loyalty?
Yeah, and I mean, only 38% of young people in America say it really matters which party wins the Congress. Only 38%. Whereas 81% of people over the age of 65 say it matters. So there's a huge difference in perception of what the outcome means for me. And you know, that's a challenge more for democracy, it seems to me. How do you make democracy more relevant to young people?
There was a good question. It's kind of ironic. Young people who are connected every second to information aren't as engaged and connected to politics. Isn't that weird? Isn't that strange? I look at you because you've already got the microphone in hand, and you're
once again, I would disagree. Young people are very engaged in politics, but it's traditional, conventional forms that the where there's the loss of trust. And I couldn't agree more that we do need to regenerate democracy in order to actually think of how our structures systematically excluding people. I mean, when young people can't find their voice and can't have their voice heard through traditional means of, like traditional politics, they'll take matters in their own hand. You can see that in so many examples of civic engagements where, I mean, with the so-called migration crisis Europe couldn't, our governments couldn't actually agree on what to do. Young people led the civic engagement movement in actually welcoming refugees, welcoming their own homes, having community actions. And in local communities, they also, of course, there were counter movements to this in terms of protests, but there was always a peaceful counter-protests done as well at the same time. You can see in Ireland examples of last year out of a lot of engagement with civil society as a whole, but where young people had a very, very big part of that. Same-sex marriage was made a reality. Just a few days ago, thousands and thousands of young people and women travelled back to Ireland, travelled back home to cast their ballot to repeal the Eighth. You see it in the States. Young people don't have a voice, and they've taken onto social media and the streets and protests in terms of in the fight against guns. And so when young people do not have a voice and cannot engage in traditional politics, they'll find other ways. They'll find other ways in actually engaging. And I think the point that was made earlier also, that the topics that are discussed, the agenda points that are discussed by a lot of parties and politicians do not resonate to young people. That is also one of the issues, of course. And the fact that the sustainability agenda, for instance, or these kind of more broader topics where exactly matter a lot to the future of young people, but then we see the results and how policies are made, that they don't actually resonate, that, again, this just perpetuates the lack of trust and actually feeling that young people are not listened to and they don't have a voice, and therefore have to find other avenues in order to actually make a difference.
Sure, Eva.
I do completely agree, but I would like to add something. Voting is nevertheless the most egalitarian way of participating, so it's the best chance for everybody to take part. And the more complex form of political participation gets, the more likely it is that only some will participate. And it's usually the more resourceful people that have more time, money, education, ability to make themselves heard, and so on. So I think besides all the wonderful examples you had, it's nevertheless important to make them vote, because that's the best way to give everybody a voice. The Austrian example is, I think, a good example to show that if you lower the voting age, it helps, because the turnout is higher among 17 and 16-year-olds than among other voters. And there is other countries who did it, like Malta recently, and Estonia will come next. And there was the Scottish independence referendum where young people did turn out and they did vote, and it was not as drastically as with the Brexit. So the youngs were in favor of the independence, I think, but only by a small margin, and in the end it was the other way around, but at least they had the chance to make their voice heard. So I think it's important.
I mean, one way to get more young people to be engaged in the formal electoral process would be to require everybody to vote. But I can tell you, we've asked the American public that, and only 17% of the American public supports that. So it's going nowhere in the United States right now. But I mean, is there any evidence that, I mean, even in countries that do require people to vote, like Belgium or Austria, I'm not aware of the data, so I don't know. Do you still get a higher lack of participation, even though it's illegal, among young people? Because I don't know that that would solve the problem of young voters.
I don't know either. Well, Austria is a country with a high turnout, let's say. So we have 70–80% of turnout in federal elections. So it's a different issue than discussing elections with 30 or 40 or 50% turnout. So, but nevertheless, even with 80% turnout, you have these gaps. According to age, but more important, according to education, according to resources. I think it's the better term than educate. It's not always education, but the lower the participation rate, the more unequal it usually is, and I think that is a problem.
It's of course a dilemma, and it's nothing new. In aging societies, as we all live in Europe and in the Western world, including America, you need to cater for the needs of the older generation, because that is what wins your votes. While it has been said at various times now, the young tend to be, tend to stress the importance of the fight against climate change. I remember a few recent Eurobarometers, that European poll. Those data always shows that the young are more EU-friendly, let's say, that they actually do support further integration, which is often the opposite of what is happening in various countries. How to resolve that dilemma? It's a big question.
Yeah, well, all the nice points on the agenda on how to include the youngsters better in politics does not take away the mere fact that they are totally outnumbered by the older people. And that balance is to be worse in the next 10, 20, 30 years. So there is even a discussion now to give parents also rights for children. So to give parents double rights. I don't know, but this is also a discussion. And then there is also for the demography as such, the shrinking of the population. We did not discuss that, but shouldn't that also be on the agenda? And one can say, well, shrinking population, get more migrants. I don't think that that's a solution. Although I welcome migrants, but they tend to have the same birth rates in the country where they're arriving, so it's not a very lasting solution. And at the same time, you see that in the younger generation, people do often not get the number of children that they want to have. So one of the solutions of the problem that we discuss here is in the demography itself, to take to make better policy, to make it better possible for younger people to combine work and family life. If we don't do that, then we will live the next 50 years with an outnumbering of the older part of the society, and we will have a pessimistic society, a more mistrusting society, more tendency to populism, etc. Only when we have children in the street we will have this positivism.
And does that sound like a sound proposal to close the gap that you and others were talking about, to make it easier for people to feel represented, to connect with politics, to make their life easier?
For sure, the fact that young people are very vulnerable at the moment, where, I mean, you look at 1 in 4 young people in Europe at least are at risk for poverty or social exclusion, that doesn't have an adverse effect on also politics, and so obviously ensuring that we have social policies that cater for the well-being of people, that it will of course have an effect. I wanted to come back also a bit on an earlier point. I mean, things that we can do that are tangible. I mean, investing in citizenship education and civic education is incredibly important, and this is something that, of course, if you lower the voting age to 16, is something that happens, which again is, you learn voting habits young, and the fact that you are then in a stable environment, you live at home, in most cases, that you learn at school and you can discuss it, then it often, might become a habit for life. But it isn't just that. If you look at the European Youth Forum, together with International IDEA, the Social Imperative, published a Youth Progress Index recently, where it's clear, we're just looking at, I mean, in terms of opportunities, jobs, health, where kind of each country is in giving young people rights. And there is a correlation between young people participating in civil society organizations and actual voter turnout. So it shows that actually engagement and it doesn't have to be about politics. It's simply participation in some sort of organization, be it a cause, be it things, there's a correlation with those young people actually being the statistics in those countries, the voter turnout is higher. So these things are incredibly important to foster. And then, of course, actually ensuring that parties are accessible for young people, that the issues discussed are accessible. These are also concrete things that can be done and can be done now in order to change this.
Has any of you any evidence that with President Macron's En Marche movement, or movement-style politics rather than traditional party politics, that style has already addressed some of those preoccupations, some of those things that make it difficult for young people to engage with traditional politics? Anyone?
I'm happy to comment on that, and I think indeed that Macron also made the assessment that traditional politics couldn't solve the problems for France, so he started something new, and everybody was laughing at that time. And the one who was the lucky one was Fillon, because it would be very easy for him to win the election. We know how history has decided, but it was the movement En Marche, which was done through social media. So social media can be used for better and for worse. Huh? We have seen both examples in recent history. But it is true that for younger people, it's easier to connect to questions to which they can contribute, engage them in a debate. You see it also in companies. The leaders in companies who say, I can hire you, you have to do this and that and that and that. The best do not go there. If as a leader you say, I have this challenge, how can I reduce my footprint? Then you hire the best. So young people are interested to be asked for and to contribute. And these are not only the highest educated people, also the younger people. So I think that ideas of having social media groups or internet discussions, or last week we organized in Frankfurt an der Oder with Polish and German population, a random population of younger and older, and we asked them, what do you think about the future of Europe? They were all engaged. And so what you see is people are not interested. They are interested if they feel that they are taken seriously, and if they can talk about things that matter for them, and then there is hope.
I saw a question here on the screen. How can the internet giants and social networks, as we're talking of, Twitter, Facebook, and all the others, how can they contribute, or how can they be used to close that political gap between the generations? Who wants to answer? Eva.
I think it is one way to make, for example, political discussions more accessible, to get it away from the local level, which is often not so interesting for young people, as you said before, because young people are not so connected to their local area of residence when they move to get educated, to get a job, to move in with friends or with a new partner. So they're usually not so locally focused as older people, and I think everything that helps to overcome this step for participating in a local area helps. And of course, internet is one way to make it possible to discuss with people who have the same interest in issues, let's say, and not live in the same street or in the same community or the same local area. So that is one very, very important point. And besides all the ways of how people communicate and how that changed, but I'm not a communication scientist, so there's thousands of things I think that would be important. But this changing from a local focus to an issue focus, I think, is very important.
I'm curious if there's any research, talking to the researchers here, about, I mean, I grew up in a small town in western Pennsylvania. My mother voted in every election for 50 years. I don't know quite why that was the case, but I think it was because she probably thought in part that her neighbors would look down on her if she didn't. So peer pressure played a great role. And it would seem to me that young people living on the internet, in social media, certainly much more so than older people, might be susceptible to their own form of peer pressure that this is like the thing you're supposed to do. You know, it would come from an anonymous rather than your next door neighbor, but it might have the same effect. But I just don't know that, if that's true. But it just seems to me we may underestimate the benefits of peer pressure through the internet to get people to engage in behavior that they otherwise wouldn't engage in.
Yeah, this is exactly how Trump mobilizes the anti-establishment.
So there would be a way to maybe use that in a different way to.
Yeah, well, it was used for the worst. But if you say, well, if you are anti-establishment, then vote, then vote, then vote. Yeah. And if there is peer pressure that of course you are anti-establishment, so then this is peer pressure. And then the response to that should be something like Macron, who says, the problems of this country can only be solved if we put them on the higher level and if we think global, etc. So I'm not campaigning here for Macron, but I just want to say that the same techniques and the same communication and the same, so we need to learn more about behavioral science. We need to learn more about behavioral science in order to also to renovate democracy.
If you talk about a low turnout as a chance, then there's probably a lot of hope for next year's European elections, where the turnout has always been historically low across the continent. Our time is already running up, but I would like to have a comment from each of you on that one last question. What do you expect things to get better or worse between now and the European election next year when it comes to engagement of young people, generational gap, and participation in politics in Europe? Whoever wants to start.
I think a lot of it, of course, depends on how the campaigns unfold, because sometimes, of course, campaigns are hijacked and questions, you know, get turned around, especially in political campaigns. But I think one of the big things that we need to do is ensure that what specifically now the EU does, and that affects people, for instance, for young people, the fact of the right to mobility, where, I mean, I live in a generation where the fact that we have the possibility to go and live and study anywhere we want and work abroad is something that a lot of people do take for granted, and only started questioning that this can be taken away the last few years, really. Or, I mean, the fact of traveling. So these kind of things, the real tangible things need to be actually brought and highlighted and talked about and said, okay, but what do you want? And exactly, once again, instead of saying, oh, we're going to do this, we're going to do this, actually ask, what is it you want? Okay, this is happening here, this is happening there. So because if we continue having this massive gap between, that a lot of people feel, between the citizens and what is happening in Brussels, this is going to be continuing a problem. So we need to actually turn around the questions and ensure that talk about what matters to people.
But there is still time, says Anna. Eva.
It's always difficult for a survey researcher to make a prognosis for within a year, because we usually are wrong. Huh? No, I think it won't be a matter of, maybe not a matter of generations or of age, but it will be a matter of does one believe in a better future, or does one believe in a worsening future? So there will be the optimists and the pessimists, and I think that's the whole point. That will be the gap underneath everything, and I think it will depend from country to country if the young people are the ones who are optimistic or who are pessimistic, and usually the young people are more interested in the European Union, and they know more than the older generation about the European Union. That's kind of contradicting everything else, because usually they can ask their parents or their grandparents if they don't know something about politics. But in the case of the EU, at least in Austria, they can't ask the grandparents, because the grandparents know less than them, because they never learned anything about it apart from the media. So maybe there will be the optimistic frontrunners, but I can't know.
There's reason for optimism. You say, Art, what's your prognosis?
Well, what I expect is that next year there will be a loss of a number of traditional parties. Europe has been ruled, or the European Union has been ruled by two political families for a while, and that is coming gradually to an end. Not in every country in the same pace, but in France you saw they are swept away. Italy has swept away. In the Netherlands, the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats together have less than 20%, and so on. So this is a fragmentation, and I think that all the official commentators will say, oh, fragmentation of the European Parliament. For me, what counts is if the younger generation comes to vote. And if we can do what in schools and with authentic leadership and a good agenda, take Erasmus. Erasmus is a huge success, but very elitarian. Why not, on the program, Erasmus Plus, go down for all students, so also for this mechanicer, also for this construction worker, also for the lady that helps in the healthcare, or for the young man that helps in the hotel room, or whatever. Erasmus Plus, make it possible to travel and to see, because once you travel, you are a perfect example. You become so European. Born in Sweden, well, I don't have to tell your CV, but also for myself, you become European when you have been outside of your own country. This is what we have to be on the agenda, and then, of course, take the courage to lower the right for voting. That cannot be done for next year, but it should be on the agenda so that it could be one of the first decisions. Once you have, and then you can work on the engagement in the schools, etc. Once you have the engagement, you have a next generation of politically engaged people.
Thank you very much. Bruce, your research shows that this decades-old, post-World War II probably, generational contract between the elder generation that says, I want that my children are better off than myself, is coming to an end. What does that tell you about, I don't want you to comment specifically on the European elections, but what does it tell you about what we've been discussing, about the engagement of young people?
Well, I do think the data that we found both in Europe and the United States is a challenging research question for places like the OECD. I mean, if people don't believe that their children are going to be better off, that the next generation is going to be better off than they are, does that change their behavior in the present? You know, does it mean, is one of the explanations why people don't save more than they used, they save less now than they used to, is because they don't think it matters? Because I can't make the future better than the past. I mean, one of the reasons people used to save in the past, we thought, was future preference. You would say, okay, I'm saving because I'm going to invest in the future. We don't know whether it's affecting people's behavior in the present, that they don't believe the future is going to be better than that. But we know historically, one of the defining characteristics of the West was that the golden age was always in the future, and then you work to make that so. What if you now think the golden age is in the past? What is that? How does that affect the present? I don't know. I don't have an answer to that question. Our data doesn't show that, but our data does show that people have lost that faith and they haven't regained it. And even though our economies have basically recovered now from the Great Recession. So maybe 5 years from now we won't have this conversation because the future will look brighter. But right now, after a decade of maybe a natural reaction that, oh, things are so bleak, and they're not so bleak anymore, at least for a larger portion, and yet people still don't have that faith in the future. And that is something I think we, as societies, it's a challenge we face.
On that skeptical note, and with some homework to do for the OECD, for our societies, I would no longer stand between you and drinks. I'd like to thank my panelists here, and please join me in thanking them, in applauding them. Thanks very much for the engaged discussion, for the debate here on stage, and enjoy the evening, as this is the last panel of today, I guess.